From Matthew chapter 13, we read these words. Jesus told them another parable. He said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemies came, and they sowed weeds among the wheat, and then they went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, 'Sir, don't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?' 'An enemy did this,' the owner replied. The servant asked him, 'Well, do you want us to go and to pull them?' 'No,' he answered, 'because while you're pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at that time, I will tell the harvester this: first, collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn.'" It's an interesting story, isn't it? Well, hang on to that parable. And let me just say that a number of years ago, a couple of friends of mine were driving down a country road. They'd driven down this road hundreds of times, but what made this time different was the fact that the county had just spread a fresh layer of gravel. How many of you know exactly what I'm talking about here? Now, I have to tell you, my friend Dale, who was behind the wheel, would admit he was probably driving a little too fast, not just for fresh gravel, probably for any gravel, and probably for any country road anywhere. But the point is this: as he drove down that road, he could feel the fresh, deep gravel begin to pull at the wheels of his car, pull him towards the ditch. How many of you have ever had an experience something like that? And so Dale did everything that your driving instructor always warned you not to do. Want to guess what that was? He overcorrected his steering. He swerved over to the other side of the road to get out of that ditch. Well, guess what happened? Now his wheels were stuck into the deep gravel on the other side of the road. And make a long story short, basically, seconds later, that car was rolling into the ditch. In fact, through the ditch, actually up into a farmer's field. And fortunately, both boys at that time were wearing seatbelts. Nobody was badly hurt. But I have always seen this story not just as a cautionary tale. I've always viewed this little story with my buddies as a parable for life. A parable for life. And here's why I say that. When you and I are under pressure, when emotion's running high, when the adrenaline is pumping in our lives, and when we're not thinking clearly, it's easy to overcompensate. You know what I mean? Rather than turning just a little bit, we turn a lot. It's easy to overreact. And what I have found in life, at least in my life, is when I overreact, there's usually trouble. There's usually danger, as there was with these two boys. Let me give you another example. As a kid growing up, I loved Westerns. Do we have any other Western fans here? Whether it was a movie or some of the old TV programs. But in all of these old programs, it seemed like there was a plot that sooner or later came up with the script. And it was this: a man would be suspected of doing something wrong, and he was put in jail. Now, you know, in those old Western towns, it seems like they never had a judge in town. They were always waiting for the judge to come from Dodge. But while they were waiting for that judge to come, the townspeople couldn't wait any longer. Emotion was running high. They wanted to take justice into their own hands, and they were quick to condemn that man that was sitting in jail. Does this sound familiar? You know what's going to happen here, don't you? So, a lynch mob assembles, vigilantes right outside the jail one night. They've got torches, they've got a rope to string this guy up. They want to just take care of this. And you know what happens. Matt Dillon, or whoever the sheriff or the marshal is, steps in, blows off his shotgun, says, "Folks, let's calm down a little bit. Be reasonable. Let's wait for the judge to get here. Let's let justice take its course." And even though the crowd is mad, in the story, they always seem to go home. They file away with their tail between their legs. And then 3 days later, the judge shows up, and suddenly there's a new piece of evidence that comes into the case. And suddenly the judge realizes, or the judge, gives a verdict and says, "This man is not guilty. This man is innocent." And all those townspeople that were so quick to judge, that were showing up with the torches and the nooses, they're a little red-faced because they realize they just about put to death an innocent man. Now you say, Pastor John, that's just a story. That's just a crazy Western. But I think, again, there's a lesson there. Don't act too hastily. Don't jump too quickly. Don't overreact. And I believe that that is what this gospel parable is also about today. Our tendency to overreact. And here it is. The story begins simple enough. There's a farmer that has sown some seeds into his field. He's a professional. He's done this many times before. He knows what he's doing. Things start out on the right foot. But one morning, one of his hired hands goes out to the field and realizes there's a lot of green stuff coming up out on that field, but not a lot of it is wheat yet. A lot of it is weeds. And he begins to wonder, and he goes to the boss and he says, "Boss, didn't you buy the high-grain wheat for the field? Or did you settle for that cheap stuff where they have weeds mixed in?" And the farmer insists, no, he bought the top of the line of the grain for the wheat. And with the expensive stuff, there shouldn't be all these weeds that are there. And so his appraisal of the situation is, this isn't because of the expensive wheat I bought. This means there's been an enemy that's come in the night who has sown the weeds out into the field to mess up my crop. This is no accident, folks. This is the work of evil people. That's what he says. And so the story continues, and the hired hand says, "So boss, what do you want us to do?" And most of us, we would come to the conclusion, well, let's get rid of those weeds. Boss, do you want me to go out and pull some weeds and restore the purity of our crop? But I realize at this point, this is not really a story about farming or about crops or about wheat or weeds. This really is a parable that Jesus is giving us about life and about people and about human nature. And our tendency to want to divide desirable people from undesirable people. Now think with me in your mind, because as we all sit here today, we've all got our own impression of who's desirable and who's not so desirable. You see, Jesus was raising philosophical, theological, and moral questions with this little parable today. And it raises the question, Lord, don't you want us to separate the bad from the good? Doesn't that just seem to make sense? Can't we put up a sign to keep the evil people out of our community? Shouldn't we just put them on a boat and send them back where they came from? Can't we pass an ordinance or something? Well, let's put up a wall. But you see, there's all sorts of attitudes like this that come up in countries, in communities, you name it, wherever it is, in churches, certainly in politics. But then comes the difficult part of the story, the thing that I never saw coming. And you might say, this is the punchline of the story. When the boss says, nope, just leave those weeds in there with the wheat. Because if you start messing with it now, you're going to pull up the good with the bad. He says, just leave it to me. I'll take care of it later when the time comes. And we say, wait a minute, Lord, again, don't you have to stand for something in life? Don't you have to draw some lines in the sand every once in a while and say, this is good, this is bad, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable? Lord, don't we have to say, you can stay, but you have to leave? Where's our backbone? After all, weeds become a real nuisance in your garden, in the field, in the world, in a community. All they do is clutter up our lives, so let's get rid of them. But again, the boss is very firm in insisting, leave the weeds alone. That's my job. That's not your job. Don't overreact. Otherwise, you may live to regret it. I've seen this sort of zeal, this sort of self-righteousness, this drive for purity happen time and time again in life. Haven't you? Have you seen a little of this here and there? You may remember the name Joseph McCarthy. How many people know that name? Raise your hand. Who goes back to those days? In the 1950s. By the way, he was from Wisconsin, was he not? Makes you proud. He was a man that wanted to pull weeds in our country. He was a man who wanted to get rid of anybody that he thought was leaning towards what? Communism, left, pinkos. He wanted to get those weeds out of here. But you know, the interesting thing is these years later, when you hear the name Joseph McCarthy, it's not usually in a positive sense, is it? It's usually in a pejorative way. And I would ask you, what sort of contribution did this weed puller really give to our country? Besides destroying the lives and reputations and careers of a number of very innocent people. and in many ways giving our country a black eye. Folks, there have always been vigilantes, people that want to overreact to certain matters to get their own way in history. The KKK, the Freemen, the neo-Nazi groups. And when you look at the world scope, you see people going after whole races of people. We call this ethnic cleansing. It's happened in Bosnia and the Congo and Sudan, and it's happened most recently in Iraq. It can happen in churches too, on a smaller basis, on a smaller level. Seems like every congregation always has somebody that wants to cast judgment on other people sitting in the pews, sitting in the chairs. People that don't think like they do, people that aren't as involved as they are or don't show up to the things that they show up to, people that don't believe the same way they do. But there seems to always be in every church somebody that wants to wipe somebody else off the books. Somebody wants to send them home and kick them out and split the church or pull out of the synod or pull out of the denomination for ethnic purity. But here's the thing. Jesus knew that this sort of overreaction always leads to trouble. This ostracizing of people, this dividing of sometimes families, of splitting up churches and giving churches black eyes. And again, it does more damage than it does help anybody. And see, here's the other thing about that. The world is watching this church, that church, any church, and realizes that so often the church is nothing but people that want to cast judgment, point a finger, cast blame on somebody else. And you know what? The world is not impressed. This is not the kind of community they want to be a part of anymore because there's so much of this. I would also add this, is that many of you know in the last few years, there's a number of ELCA churches that left our synod. They didn't like what they saw happening theologically, so they picked up their marbles, took the ball and bat, and went on their own way. Interestingly now, if you talk to some of those people, some of those congregations, and I talk to some of their pastors, they realize they overreacted because they've traded one set of problems for another whole set of problems, and sometimes there's been more damage done than there has been good. Let me say this. My mother enjoyed raising flowers and herbs in this little garden that she had in the backyard of the house that I grew up in Lakewood, Ohio. And one summer day, my mother made the colossal mistake of asking her oldest son to go out and to weed that garden. You know where this is going, don't you? This was the first and last time she ever asked me to help. And here's the thing. I was probably a junior high kid, middle school kid at the time, and I went out there, and I didn't really know what's a weed and what's an herb and what's a flower. And it was early in the spring, and you get the point. By the time I was done, I had massacred her garden. I couldn't tell what was what. And sometimes in life, we have a difficult task in determining who's a weed and where's the wheat. Look around the sanctuary right now. The law of averages says there's got to be some weeds here. Who is that? Person next to you? Or is that you? And who's the wheat? We don't always know. There was another incident that took place in the church that I grew up in Lakewood, Ohio, years ago. This was back in 1971. And it seemed that a certain high school student had invited some of his rowdy friends to come and join him on a Sunday morning at church. And they showed up. They came reluctantly, but they showed up with that youthful attitude there as well. Now, how many of you go back to 1971? Who was alive then? Anybody? Now think with me, what was going on in 1971? These kids, this roughy, scruffy group of kids showed up, and they had long hair, and they had fringe jackets on, and they had buckskin boots up to here, and you get the point. Hippies, right? Now, this was not the apparel of most people that were worshiping in St. Peter and Paul Lutheran Church at that day. And as they sat there, they began to draw stares from church people, mostly older people, but other people too. And here's the thing is, these boys that were there that day, they were not about to be intimidated. So somebody stared at them, and they stared right back. And it was quite an eventful day at St. Peter and Paul that Sunday morning. But when it was all done, it was obvious that there were some older folks that were not happy. They were not amused that these kids had showed up there at church that day. And afterwards, an older lady came over, and she began to bellow, "How dare you bring these animals into the house of God?" That's what she said. How dare you bring these animals into the house of God? Oh, well, that's an interesting way to greet new people. And all the dear lady could see was weeds. Long hair, beads, fringe jackets. Didn't look like the rest of the people there. Let's pull the weeds, let's get rid of them. They don't belong here. She was probably right. There were some real weeds in that bunch. But I'm here also to tell you in 2016, today, one of those young men ended up being the principal of a Christian high school in Ohio. Another one led a worship band in his church for over 30 years. And another one ended up being your pastor. So, you never do know. You never do know what's out there. And it seems to me that Jesus gives us his parable to remind us life is not always neat and orderly and tidy and clean. Life sometimes is complicated. Sometimes it's messy. There are gray areas, there are unknowns, there are surprises. And so when we start drawing lines of who's on this side and who's on this side, we take a dangerous step. Because here's the thing, people can change, can't they? People can change. My guess is you've changed at some point in life. And you see, if it's just human eyes or human heart that's looking at that, we don't know. We don't know what somebody's going to grow into. We don't have the patience to wait and see whether it's a weed or whether it truly is wheat. So we need to be very careful as we go about this. And here's, again, what the parable tells us. This is not our call. It's not my call. It's not your call. It's God's call. And this is something that Jesus was trying to always impress upon his people. Judgment is mine, he says. Let me close with one last story. It was a few years ago that a high-powered stockbroker in New York City was dating a beautiful young woman. She was a model and she aspired to be an actress. And this young stockbroker fell for this young woman in a big way. In fact, so much that he was planning on asking the young woman to marry him. But he also came from a high society family there in New York City, and so he didn't want to embarrass his family and later find out that there was some skeleton in this young woman's closet. And so he hired a detective agency to look into her past, to do a little studying with any dirt that might be there. Well, this young stockbroker didn't reveal his name or his identity. He just paid the bill for this detective agency to take care of this. And a few weeks later, they came back with photos, and they'd done some interviews with people, all very nondiscreet. They had some documentation. They assured this young stockbroker that there was nothing they could find in this young woman's past that would be dishonorable or would come back to embarrassment. But they said one thing in some of the interviews. They had talked to people that this was the red flag that was raised. Some of her friends said she was dating this stockbroker that had very questionable and shady business practices and ethics. All right? You see where I'm going with this thing? Who are the weeds? Where's the wheat? And can you and I really tell which is which? Again, the farmhand asked, "Do you want me to take care of these weeds?" And the boss said, "Nope, just let them grow. Just leave them there in the field. I'll wait and see what comes of it, but that'll be my job, not yours." And so, friends, today, in our lives, in our church, in our community, in our country, in our world, we wait, we watch, we wonder, and we try not to overreact. We try to trust in God's grace, not our own judgment. Let's pray. Oh Lord, in this morning we ask that you would make us patient people, make us trusting people. Help us to believe, Lord, that you've got a plan in this, what sometimes looks like a crazy, mixed-up world. Help us to believe that you've got things worked out, and keep us from embarrassing ourselves. Keep us from embarrassing you. And God, help us to be cautious and overreacting at times in life. Help us to live by your grace. These things we ask and pray in this morning, and let all the people of God together say, amen.